I think it's pretty misleading when our current president and President Ronald Reagan before him discussed dismantling the Department of Education in order to send education policies and practice back to the states. And in this video, I'll explain why. The Department of Education, you see, is not just a department in the traditional sense. Since 1979, the Secretary of the Department of Education has sat on the cabinet of the president. Members of the cabinet provide counsel to the president on various matters that are critical to American citizens. There are currently 15 members of the cabinet that serve the president in areas such as the Department of Treasury, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Labor. And the Secretary of State and the Attorney General serve on the cabinet. You see, President Jimmy Carter thought that the Department of Education needed and deserved to be at the table when cabinet members discussed national policy. Early in his presidency, he worked with Congress through the arduous process of passing the Department of Education Organization Act, which he signed into law in October 1979. I think it's important to remember the intent behind the Department of Education Organization Act of 1979 because this is what we are in danger of losing if Trump is successful in eliminating the department. First, the education profession will no longer be represented at the cabinet level meetings as policies are discussed and decided, and the president is counseled about what's in the best interest of the nation's children, schools, parents, and teachers. I'll read a few passages from President Carter's signing statement upon the signing of the Department of Education Act into law. In his speech, President Carter stated, "Education is our most important national investment. It commands the time and attention of 60 million Americans, 3 citizens in 10. It consumes an annual public and private expenditure in excess of $120 billion. Every citizen has a vital personal stake in this investment. Our ability to advance both economically and technologically, our country's entire intellectual and cultural life depend on the success of our great educational enterprise." President Carter acknowledged that primary responsibility for education should rest with those states, localities, and private institutions that have made our nation's educational system the best in the world. But he also acknowledged that the federal government has far too long failed to play its own supporting role in education as effectively as it could. Instead of assisting school officials at the local level, it has too often added to their burden. Instead of setting a strong administrative model, the federal structure has contributed to bureaucratic buck passing, and instead of stimulating needed debate of educational issues, the federal government has confused its role of junior partner in American education with that of silent partner. Keep in mind, he's talking about America before the federal Department of Education. President Carter goes on to state, "The time has passed when the federal government can afford to give second level, part time attention to its responsibilities in American education. If our nation is to meet the great challenges of the 1980s, we need a full time commitment to education at every level of government, federal, state, and local. The Department of Education bill will allow the federal government to meet its responsibilities in education more effectively, more efficiently, and more responsively. First, it will increase the nation's attention to education. For the first time, there will be a cabinet-level leader in education, someone with the status and the resources to stir national discussion of critical education concerns. Second, it will make federal education programs more accountable. For the first time, there will be a single cabinet secretary responsible full-time for the effective conduct of federal education programs. Third, it will streamline administration of aid to education programs. For the first time, there will be a direct, unobstructed relationship between those who administer aid to education programs and those who actually provide education in our country. Fourth, a Department of Education will save tax dollars. By eliminating bureaucratic layers, the reorganization will permit direct, substantial personnel reductions. By enhancing top-level management attention to education programs, it will earn improved educational service at less cost. Fifth, it will make federal education programs more responsive. Placing education in a highly visible department of its own gives the American people a much clearer perspective on what the federal government is doing in education and who is responsible for those activities. It allows people to better decide what the government should and should not be doing in education. Six, a Department of Education will ensure that local communities retain control of their schools and education programs. That is essential if our schools are to serve their students properly, and the Department of Education will therefore not permit the federal government to begin making decisions on education policy that are best made at the local level. President Carter's speech made it clear that states and local governments always maintained control over education. Throughout federal education reform initiatives, particularly when President George W. Bush enacted No Child Left Behind and President Barack Obama brought us the Common Core state standards, it was always clear that decisions about curriculums were within the domains of the states. That very fact was but one reason that these federal education reform initiatives ultimately failed, even when the federal government applied carrot and stick approaches for implementation, tying federal funds to these programs. The Federal Department of Education does, however, contribute essential funds for all schools across the nation to ensure that students have equal and equitable access to high-quality education. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, federal funding accounts for about 11% of all public school revenue. For certain states, this figure is much higher. How much federal funding a state receives in federal funds for education depends on how much federal funding is needed for the K-12 students the state serves, based on factors like poverty. School districts that have higher tax bases do not need as much federal funding to provide an equitable education for their students. However, school districts that serve higher populations of poor families and have lower tax bases need greater levels of federal funding in order to provide at least a semblance of equitable education for their students. So I urge all Americans to understand two things. First, states already have ultimate control over education, particularly with regard to curriculum and assessment. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this rash of states implementing anti-DEI policies, banning books that promote racial and cultural equity, and attempting to impose certain conservative ideologies in school classrooms. And second, eliminating the Department of Education will defund education and leave many teachers without jobs, children without teachers, parents without supports for their children, and schools without adequate funding to provide equitable educational opportunities for their students. Thank you for watching. I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and subscribe. There's more to come from the Department of Education.